Hello everyone, welcome to my first HTML tutorial. It's made for beginners, so no prior knowledge is required. So before starting, you will need to install some text editor. I suggest you install Visual Studio Code, but if you're using any other text editor, you can follow this tutorial. If you want to install Visual Studio Code, you should go to their website and download the installation file depending on your operating system. You can also try Atom. Basically, it's the same process of installing. You can try with Sublime Text, or you can even try with Notepad++. So if you want to have the same development environment as I have, just install Visual Studio Code. So what is HTML? It is a markup language for creating web pages. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And what is the hypertext? What is the markup? Hypertext refers to hyperlinks that the web page might contain, and markup refers to the way of using tags in defining web page structure. It is not a programming language. It is a document that is read and understood by a web browser and rendered on your screen. The structure of every web page is written in HTML. If you want to style any web page, HTML is not enough and you should use CSS. As any document we write, HTML document has its own structure. Each HTML element is wrapped with a tag. That way we specify that everything inside the tag belongs to that element. Tags are just keywords that we write to indicate the HTML element. Tags are not visible on the web page. Most elements have the opening and closing tags, but there are also ones with self-closing tags. The syntax is like in this example, a combination of angle brackets and the tag name. The basic HTML structure look like this. We have a doc type, HTML, head, and body. I know these words sound confusing, but don't worry, we are going to tackle it later with more practical examples. Doc type will tell the browser that type of the document is HTML. HTML is a container element that wraps all other elements. Head is the element which contains metadata about HTML document. It contains page title, description, styles, links, and scripts. So everything in the head element is not directly visible on our web page. For example, if you open some page in your browser, you will see the title in your tab. The title is the element that is defined inside the head element. The body is the element where we write HTML elements that will be visible on our web page in the browser. For example, elements like paragraph, images, headings, articles, and other HTML elements. So let's create an HTML document. First, I will create a folder where I want to place HTML pages that we are going to create. You can open the folder with Visual Studio Code. You can just drag and drop the folder inside, or you can choose Open Folder options. Let's make Visual Studio Code screen bigger and create a new HTML file. Note that this file has HTML extension, and index is the common name that is used for default page on a website. Let's create a basic HTML structure. Start with the doc type. That will tell the browser that type of this document is HTML. Then add HTML wrapper element, which wraps all other HTML elements inside. Inside HTML element, we will add head and body elements. Now this is the basic HTML structure. Inside the head, we are going to add some page metadata, and inside the body, we are going to add some HTML elements that are going to be visible on our web page. So let's create a paragraph element that we are able to see in our web browser. Create an opening and closing tags with the P letter. Inside the P tags, add some textual content. Now let's see how this looks in the browser. I will open index.html file with the Google Chrome. Alright, this is how our web page looks. We are available to see the content of our HTML document, but we don't see tags. If you want to see what are the elements on any web page, you can right-click on any web page in the browser and select Inspect. This is a dev tool that is provided to us by a browser. By hovering with mouse on any HTML element, elements on the screen will be highlighted. Let's move on to the head element and add some metadata about our web page. Meta elements are used for the specification of the page. Create a meta element with a self-closing meta tag and a charset attribute inside. Meta charset tells the browser what character set to use. UTF-8 is a character encoding standard that covers most of the characters and symbols. Attributes provide us additional information about the element. In the head element, you can also import other files, such as CSS, for example. For that, you should use link tag with the rel attribute and the value style sheet, and href with the URL to that CSS file that you want to import. Let's create an empty CSS file. Now inside the href attribute, we will specify the path to that CSS file. We are not going to use CSS in this tutorial, but it's important to know how to import CSS. This ./styles.css means that the styles file is in the same folder where the index.html is. Let's add title to this page that will be seen on the Browsers tab. You can also specify some meta tags that are important for search engine optimization. I will create a meta description tag where you can add some descriptive content about your web page. Let's also create meta author tag, and you can place your name there as a content. I showed you how to import CSS file in this HTML, so let's do the same for JavaScript. In order to do that, we are going to use the script tag. I will create an empty JavaScript file that we are going to import. Now, instead of using href attribute as we do for the link tag, script tag has source attribute that basically do the same thing. Let's see how these changes look in the browser. With the right click and clicking Inspect, you can open DevTool. In the Elements tab, you are able to see the changes that we did inside the head element. Clicking on Sources tab, you're able to see the external file that is included inside the index.html. There are 6 heading elements and they are sorted by importance from H1 with the highest font size to H6 with the lowest font size. If you want to display a main header on the page, you should use h1 element. You can use whatever textual content inside, and let's see how it looks in the browser. So you can see that the font size of the heading element is much bigger than the font size of the paragraph. Let's create h2 element. It also has an opening and closing tags, and just put some text inside. So you can see that the font size of h2 element is slightly smaller than h1 element, and it's also bigger than the paragraph. Let's create other heading elements. There are no strict rules when to use h1 and h6, for example, but it's important to make sure that your element describes the structural meaning of your page. Basically, you should use h1 and h2 to mark important headings. And for some less important headings, you should use h3, h4, and h5 and h6. So now we are able to see all of them compared. These differences in font size are from browser's default styles, and it will be overridden when you include some CSS styles. Please notice how heading elements and paragraph elements take the full available width of the screen. You can see this highlighted area. That's because these elements are block level elements. So block elements are elements that take the full width of available horizontal space. They take a whole line of the page. On the other hand, inline elements take only space that is necessary, and that space is basically defined by the size of the content inside. You can have multiple inline elements in one line, which is not the case with block elements. Now imagine that we need to group some elements under one element. We can use a div element, which is a generic container element. Create an opening and closing div tags and place the heading content inside. I will do the same for other heading elements. The purpose of div is to separate divisions and sections on the page. For example, we might want to group a couple of paragraphs together or to group other elements in one division. Div elements are block level elements, so they took the whole width of the screen. Let's put also some paragraph elements inside. So with this example, I wanted to show you how to group heading elements and accompanying paragraphs inside one wrapper element, which can be useful later for styling or better structuring of HTML document. Of course, you can put also more elements inside. Let's see how these changes looks in the browser. Visually nothing has changed, but if you check HTML structure, you will see some differences. Being able to structure HTML document in different ways is important for styling your page with CSS. Let's talk about some commonly used attributes for elements inside the body. Attributes are used when we want to apply some specific characteristics for an element. I will add some class attributes to our div elements. You should use a class attribute when you want to identify an element in CSS or JavaScript, in order to specify some behavior and appearance of that element. You should write a descriptive class names in order to easily understand what is the purpose of that element. You can also apply multiple class names for one element, and different elements can have the same class names. In this example, we might use these class names as a selector of these elements in CSS, And we can set, for example, specific background color for elements with the class name smaller header wrapper, or some specific font size for elements with the class name main heading wrapper. You can also use the ID attribute for the same purpose, but ID has some differences compared to class. It should have a unique value on the web page, which means it is used to identify only one element on the page, and therefore elements can have only one ID value. And let's see how this looks in the browser. So attributes are not directly visible on the web page. You should use the browser's DevTool in order to see them. There are some semantic alternatives that I want to show you. When you are using div element, it is just a generic wrapper element. It doesn't tell much about the content inside. Main element should wrap the main content of the page. That should be the content that is unique on every page. So elements that are common on the most of the web pages shouldn't be inside the main element. For example, website navigation are often the same on every page, so it shouldn't be inside the main element. Next alternative is the section element. A section can be used to mark a generic group of thematically related content. That means that all the content in one section should be related. I will use this part of HTML to create section with the class name heading section. For example, some pages might have an introduction section, about section, copyright section. All the elements can be grouped in portions that will represent the structural meaning of the web page. I will create some sections inside the main element. So let's imagine that the main element will contain the group of some articles. I will create another one with the same class name. Okay, two headers are too much. And let's change the header's content. In the other section, I will use the same structure, but with different content. Try to make your class names as descriptive as possible, so it will make your code much more readable. So let's check how it looks in the browser. Right-click on your page and click Inspect. Now we can see where is the section element and where is the main element and what is the content of the main element. Another alternative to div element is the article element. It is a block level element and it is used to wrap content such as blog posts, news, comments, and stuff like that. So in this particular case, we can use it to wrap this heading element and the div. So nothing is changed visually, but if you open the browser's DevTools, you can see a change in the structure. So what is an article without any image inside? Let's enrich our article content by creating an image tag. Source attribute is very important. Inside source attribute, you should provide the URL of the image you want to display. I will download the image from the website unsplash.com. Let's search, for example, rain images, because it's rainy at my place. Thanks, Alex Folguera, for this photo. I will rename it before using on the web page. Let's copy and paste it into our project. But first I will create a folder with the name assets, and inside that I will create a folder with the name images, and inside that I will place our image. This will make it easier if you need to find something in your project, and you can also move CSS and JavaScript files to assets. So the value of the source attribute should be the path to the image. By writing dot slash, you will access the path where the current file is, which is in this case index.html. The alt attribute is the alternative text that should be shown in case the image cannot be displayed. You should also notice that the image tag is the self-closing tag. We can see that this image is really huge in the browser. We can make it look smaller by adding some new attributes. Let's set the width attribute to 500 pixels. Let's change a little bit the content of this article. So this will be an article about the weather in Rome, I guess. You can play around a little bit and add some more HTML elements in this article. Now I have a challenge for you. Pause the video and try creating a new HTML document in the same folder where the index.html document is, and move the whole weather article section from index.html to that page. I hope you managed to do that, but in case you had some troubles, you can follow me now. First, I will create the weather.html file. Tell the browser that the type of this document is HTML. Create the basic HTML structure with the head and body. And let's put the weather article content inside the body. We can also wrap it with the main element. In practice, you will not have that many levels of nesting elements if it's not necessary for CSS styling purposes, but we do it like this in order to practice HTML elements. Let's also add some elements inside the head. You can also play around with the meta tags and maybe discover some more tags for the head element. Let's remove weather article from index.html. Now, if we change browser's URL to weather.html, we are going to open our new page. We can also do it by opening weather.html directly. Now we have these two pages opened in two different tabs. It would be nice if we can connect them, so we can create a link from one page to another. Let's do that. I will create a section that will contain navigation link elements. I will add a class attribute with some appropriate name. I will create a link element with an anchor tag, and you can put whatever content inside. href attribute is very important. Here you should specify the path to the page that you want to open by clicking on this link. In this case, I want to open index.html page. Let's refresh the weather page, and here's the link to home page. I will do the same for index.html. I will create a link to weather HTML page. Change the content of the link to weather page and also href attribute. Now when you refresh the page, you have both links to home and to weather page. There are also some additional attributes for link elements, and one of them is target. One commonly used value is _blank. And now when you click on the link, it should open the page in a new tab. I will remove it since it's not necessary for this example. One of the things that is good to know about hyperlinks is that they can be used for downloading some files. So I will create a hyperlink that will download the image after user clicks on it. Did we mention a title attribute so far? It will create a small tooltip when the user hovers with his mouse over this element. And inside href attribute, we should place the path to the image. And by adding download attribute, this link will be able to download the image. Okay, so we have a small problem. The reason why the download link doesn't work is that the browser doesn't serve HTML content through web server. So you can see in the browser's URL there is a file label. That means that we are just reading the resources from our computer. In order to make this works, I will go to Visual Studio Code extensions and search for live server. Click on install. And it should be ready. You can click on the Go Live button, and now we serve our HTML page through web server, which is a much better practice. You can see that by clicking on download image, we are now able to download the rainy day image. So you should know that the hyperlink is an inline element. So it won't take the full width of the screen, it will take just the width of the content inside. And we can prove that by placing it next to image element. So on the other hand, div elements are block level elements, so they took the full width of the screen. Let's continue with learning some new HTML elements. I will create a new section element where I will place list elements. For example, I want to make a list of block elements in HTML. Let's also create the heading element. And now I want to create a list wrapper element. Create an UL opening and closing tag, which stands for unordered list. Inside list element, we can create list item elements. So I will create a list of block elements. It's good to know that you shouldn't create li elements outside of UL. And let's see how it looks in the browser. So you can see that each li element has dot in front of the content. So let's change UL to OL, which means ordered list. So now in the browser, you will see that we have numbers instead of dots. One of the elements that is commonly used along with UL and list items is navigation element. You can create it with opening and closing nav tag. And inside navigation, you can place unordered list with the list items of hyperlinks. And let's also create one more hyperlink, but in this case for the page that doesn't exist. By adding hashtag inside href attribute, user will stay on the page even after clicking on the link. One good thing to know is that the link element can be used for scrolling to the certain element on the page. So for example, we want to scroll the page to the bottom paragraph when user clicks on this link. We are just going to use href attribute and the ID of the bottom paragraph. ID should be unique for each element. So inside the href attribute, put hashtag and the ID of the element. So now when you click on this link, your page should be scrolled to the bottom paragraph. I will make the height of the screen smaller so we can test it easier. Okay, so now we are going to learn about some form elements. I will create a new HTML file and I will create a basic HTML structure inside. So if you feel confident, you can do this on your own without following this part. I will just create a title and some basic meta tags. I will create h1 element with the content form page. Form element is a container for inputs, buttons, and input labels. Label element should tell the user more about the input purpose. It's just like a heading for inputs. I will create an input element where user should type first name. You can specify what type of input you want to display by adding a type attribute to the input element. In this case, we want a textual input. Let's go to browser's DevTools with inspect and see how the structure looks. You can see that input and label elements are both inline elements. There is also another way of using label with input. You can place the input inside the label. So you can see in the browser that nothing is changed visually. Type attribute is a mandatory attribute for input elements. We can also use other attributes such as placeholder that will display the text before user starts typing in the input. It is basically used when you want to provide more information about the input field. Next attribute that you can use is autofocus. So the input will be focused when you open the page. You can also add some generic attributes such as ID. When you have a long list of attributes, you can increase readability by putting it one below another. And let's add a value attribute. Value is basically the text that user types in the input field, but it is used commonly when you want to have a default value even before user starts typing. We can also add some validation rules attributes, such as max length and min length. So right now we are not able to type more than 10 characters. We can also add a name attribute. This is a specific attribute that is used when user submits the form and we want to have a reference of the data that is being submitted. If we type some text in the input field and press enter, we can see that the validation rules are triggered. So let's continue with another input field. In this case, we are going to create input with the type password. So in the browser, you can see that the value you type is hidden. We can also add a placeholder attribute. You can basically play around with the attributes that we added for the input with the type text. And we can make these attributes more readable. So let's continue with different types of input fields. And in this case, I will create the label I love HTML. For the type attribute of this input, I will use checkbox. So by clicking on this label, the input field will be checked or unchecked. If you want to use checkbox input outside of label, you need to create some attributes that will connect them. Input must have an ID value. And label will have for attribute. And the value will be ID of the input field. And it works. We can remove the attributes just to see how it works without them. So nothing happens when we click on the label. It works only when we click on the checkbox. There is also a checked attribute, which will make this input checked by default. In case you have some problems with the live server, you can always open your pages with the browser directly. But it is much better if you use live server. So let's continue with the attribute disabled. We can also add disabled attribute to the input with type text. So we are not able to change the value or to check or uncheck the input field. There is also a similar attribute, read-only. So a user is not able to change the value, but if user submits the form, the value will be passed to the server. So we can use div elements to structure our form differently. Div elements take the full width of the screen, so in that case our form items will be one under another. So it will be easier to see form items on the page. And the last one. So this is how it looks. Without CSS is not that beautiful, but I think it is more clear. You can see in the dev tools how div elements take the full width of the screen. Another alternative if we want to display inline elements in each new line is a break element. It is a simple self-closing BR tag. So you can see that this element creates a line break in page content. We can also use a horizontal rule element. This is basically a horizontal line that separates the content on the page. And let's create one more for the last form item. So this looks a little bit better. Okay, so let's create a different section in this form, and that will be a job title. First job title will be front-end developer, and I will create a new input with type radio. Let's also add a name attribute with the value job position or job title, whatever you want. And the value of this input will be front-end developer. I will also add ID attribute and for attribute for the labels, so they will be connected. Another job title will be backend developer. I will use the same attributes for the input. The content of the value attribute must be different, and also ID must be different. And one more job title. In this case, I will put the input inside the label. It is faster because I don't have to create ID and 4 attributes. Let's see how this looks in the browser. So we have radio buttons. It is useful when user needs to select one of different options. We can separate them with break elements, so each radio button will be in a new line. I would also like to put input radio button in front of the label. It will look much better in the browser. Yeah, it looks much better when everything is in line. So this form starts to look as job apply form. So let's put an email field. I will add type email to this input. It will work exactly the same as type text. The only difference that we are going to have with this input is that we will have the email validation. So let's continue with some new input types. In this case, we will use input with a type number, and we will use it for salary expectation. So you can see that you are not able to type any letters, you can just type numbers. And we have these arrows that we can use to increase or decrease the amount. So let's continue with new input type. We want to make user able to upload CV for this job apply. For that purpose, we will use type file. Inside the accept attribute, we can specify what file formats are supported. So we have this choose file button that will open the dialog where we are going to select the file. So it's not the best idea to put a photo as your CV unless you are a photographer. We can also put the input element inside the label, so the label will be clickable. And if we want to allow user to upload multiple files, we can use multiple attribute. Let's add a new break element and horizontal rule so we can create a new input element. Next input field will be a cover letter. For that purpose, we will use text area element. Text area element has exactly the same purpose as an input with a type text. The only difference is that text area is used when we have a larger text and we want to have text in multiple lines. You also have the ability to resize the text area. You can also specify width and height of the text area by adding calls and rows attributes. So let's continue with mastering form and input HTML elements. I will separate form items with break and horizontal rule. And I want to give a user an option to select a favorite programming language. I will use a select element with options inside. So select element is basically drop down for options inside. So I will give a user a couple of options and let's see how it looks in the browser. So we have a select box where user can select a language from the list. Each option should have a value, so when user submits the form, that value should be sent to server. Nothing is changed visually, but we can see changes when we open browser's DevTools. We can also add name attribute to select element. So when user clicks on option, that value will be stored inside select input. We can also make a default selection. You can also add some more options. For example, I will add all. By adding disable attribute, user will not be able to change anything. It's the same as for other input fields. We can group options with opt-group element. So it will look much better if you have a long list of options. Label is like a heading for that group. So let's remove disabled and see how it looks in the browser. So our job application form seems to be ready. We need to provide to users a way to submit the form. And for that purpose, we are going to use type submit. Value is just the text of the button. Let's just quickly add break and horizontal rule elements. So let's submit the form and apply for this job. The URL is changed. We have some URL parameters from our form. First name is equal to John. These values are get from input attributes, name and value. Let's fill the rest of the form fields. So now when we click on submit button, you can see that each value is associated with the name of the input. This data is something that we want to send to the server, but that's more advanced topic. An alternative to input with type submit is a button element. Honestly, I tend to use button elements more for this purpose, but both solutions are correct. We already used some of the validation rules with the attributes. We can also add some more validation rules, for example, for minimum and maximum value for the input with type number. We have this minimum and maximum number of characters. Let's format these attributes a little bit. We can also add some validation rules for text area. And we can make this field required. So you can see that we are not able to submit the form if input values are invalid. Validation messages are displayed automatically. We can also remove default value from input text, and we can also remove read-only. Password field will be required. So you can play around with the attributes to see how these changes will look in the browser. Let's fill the form now with the correct data. I hope you love HTML after this tutorial, but we should connect the label with the input field. So when we press on the label, input will be checked. Don't be modest when it comes to your salary. So now we have our form data in the URL, which is good. I want to show you a couple of more input fields that are not commonly used, but they can be interesting. One of them is input with type range. Range input provides a slider where user can select a number between two values. Another very interesting type is a color. This input will create a color picker in your browser. You can select whatever color you like from the color palette, and you can also search for the color with the color code. Another input type that is worth to mention is type date. This type will create a date picker input in your browser. So there is a small calendar icon in the input. You can easily search for a date that you want to add to this input field. Here is the option to select a specific year. And the last input type that I want to show you is input type search. It is very similar to the input type text with one small difference. So when you type a search term in the input, you have this X button if you want to remove the content. So it's enough with the input fields. I will create a new page with the name table page HTML. I will start with the basic HTML structure, doc type, HTML head, title, meta tags, and body in the end. So in this HTML document, we are going to practice table elements. First, I'm going to create a section wrapper of the table, and I will add a class attribute. Inside that, I will create a table element. So I want to make a table with HTML elements that we learned so far. Let me switch the page to table page HTML. We don't have much to see here, so let's go to HTML document and put some data. First, we are going to create a table head element. Then we should create a table row with table cells. Table cells inside table head element are created with th tag. So we want to place data about the element with and tag. So right now we can only see table head element with table cells. Let's create table body element and put some data inside. In the first row, I want to put div element. So the name of the element is div. It takes full width of the screen because it is a block level element, and the tag is just opening closing tag. So now we also have a table body displayed on the page. In the next table row, I will put section element. It takes full width of the screen, the same as div, and it has opening and closing tags. Next, it would be input element. So it takes just the self width because it is inline element and it has self closing tag. And the close friend to input label. It is inline element and it has opening and closing tags. Okay, so our table is growing. It will be nice if we can put some border between cells. So now it looks more like a table. There are few handy attributes if you want to increase the size of the cell. You can use a row span attribute. So now this cell spans 2 rows. There is also a col span attribute, which is the same just for the columns. If you want to create a sidebar, a good element for that is a side. It is a block level element, so it is exactly like div, but as I mentioned, the purpose of this element is to wrap the side content of the page. So let's put some meaningful content inside just for practicing. We can put a list of input types that we learned so far. So let's see how it looks in the browser. Of course, this content is not put on the side of the page because we will need CSS styling for doing that. And one more element that is commonly used, it is footer. It is a block level element exactly like div or section. It is used to wrap a content that is at the bottom of the page or at the bottom of some section of the page. We can put some content inside just for practicing. And let's see how it looks in the browser. Okay, let's create a new HTML page. I would like to talk a little bit about some text formatting elements. So let's first create a basic HTML structure for this page. And inside the body element, I will create an article element with some large textual content. Let's load this page in the browser. So now we can see this article. So if we want to wrap some content of this paragraph without breaking a line, we can use span element. So you can see that the paragraph is not changed visually, but if you go to DevTools, you can see that some parts of the text are wrapped with a span element. So span elements are inline elements, and that is the reason why we didn't break the line of the text. If you want to make some parts of the text bold, you can use B tag for that. Strong tag is exactly the same as a big tag. If you want to have underline in some parts of the text, you can use inserted element or ins tag. Let's enrich our article and create one more paragraph. And I will create one more element that is used for wrapping quotations. That is a block quote element. So you can see that block quote elements have this indentation, but it can be changed when we use some CSS styles. Okay, so let's make this part of the text italic. So it behaves exactly the same as others text formatting elements. Okay, so let's make this article a little bit interesting and we will add a video element. I will create a section element for that with a class attribute video section. So let's create a video opening and closing tags with a source tag inside. We should have a type attribute with a type of this video, and we should also have a source attribute which is exactly the same as for the image element. I prepared a video for that and I will add it inside assets folder, and I will create a videos folder. So let's specify a path to our video. You can add multiple source elements, so in case that the browser doesn't support some formats, it will try to load video from another source. You can also add some text that will be displayed in case the browser doesn't support your video sources. Okay, so we need to reduce the size of this video. And we can do it exactly the same as for the image element. So we have a video element, but nothing happens when we click on it. In order to make it works, we are going to add controls attribute. So now the video controls are displayed. So we are able to pause it, start it, open it in the full screen mode, basically everything that you need. If you want to make your video start when the page is loaded, you should add autoplay attribute and muted attribute. One good thing to know is that you can write comments in your HTML document. It is useful if you need to add some additional description for your code. You can also add to-do items as a comment. So I wanted to dedicate one HTML document for some common mistakes that people sometimes make. I think it can be useful because you can avoid these kind of mistakes. So first one is make sure that you always include CSS inside the head element. You can include JavaScript files both in the head or at the bottom of the body element. You should try to avoid too many nesting of elements. So in this case, we have a lot of unnecessary elements. It is a good practice to use semantically correct elements. For example, like article instead of div when there is a place that is suitable for that. Try to have meaningful and descriptive class names. If you have some really complex HTML structure, you can use a comment to mark the end of some sections. So it will make your code more readable. So one more example of using semantically correct HTML elements. So if you have a long list of items, you can use the div elements, but it is a much better practice if you use UL and LI elements. So this is not only important for the readability of your code, but it is also important for accessibility of your web page. And one more thing is that you should avoid putting block elements inside inline elements. For example, like putting div and paragraph inside span element. So this is the end of this tutorial. I hope that it was helpful for you, and if you like it, please press the like button and subscribe. And if you have any comments, please write me below so we can discuss. See you, bye.